So I'm just going to jump right into the talk, Alex, and talk a little bit about what we've seen in the past few days with COVID, and also point out the fact that you've actually pointed out a few of the privacy and security concerns. And I've also been reading news about Google and Apple tracking our movements as a result of COVID-19. So my first question to you is, what does this mean for the general public's privacy and security for the sake of public health, and what should we be aware of?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. This is a really complicated issue, and it's a fascinating time because there's been a lot of discussion about digital privacy when neither the needs for violating people's privacy were that important, nor was the impact of the violation, right? So we've had a lot of kind of low stakes arguments of what kind of data can be used to show somebody ads, for example, right? And like all millions and millions of dollars of lawyer hours spent on arguing over these things about, in what ways can Google show you ads, or Facebook, and what kind of data can they use? And now all of a sudden we have the stakes raised in both ways, and that, pretty much every government in the world is trying to figure out a way to track and trace infections, right? That they want to know when people are infected, and then who they came in contact with, and then have the ability to reach out to those people with whom they might have infected to quarantine them. Every country in the world, democracies, developing democracies, and autocracies. And so at the same time you have this incredibly important need, you also have the fact that the basic thing that governments want to do here is something that's very, very intrusive, right? And kind of, if somebody is infected with a disease and they're sitting in a hospital and a public health doctor does an interview with them, they're going to do something that's actually quite invasive, right? They're asking them about a lot of private information. And governments now want to turn phones into the doctor. And there's really no precedent here for every country in the world wanting to do the same thing at once, but then trying to do so compatible with their ideals and their laws and such. And so you have especially two companies, Apple and Google, as the two manufacturers of the most used mobile platforms, stuck in the middle, where they are trying to come up with solutions that are useful, but not so useful that they can be turned into something that's really oppressive.
Yeah. And I was reading something by Yuval Harari recently, and he talked about under the skin surveillance, basically pointing out how physical reactions could be tracked by governments. So it's no longer just, like I'm tracking, where you're moving, but now I'm tracking whether you're reacting, you're laughing to certain things on your phone. So what I would like to say is, what is the role of startups here? The Googles and the Apples and maybe more that are coming into the play. What are their roles here?
Right. So for the mobile platforms, Apple and Google, they have a very difficult choice in that they have spent years refining the privacy models that they apply to apps that run on their phones, right? So both Google and Apple kind of reserve for themselves certain things that you're not allowed to do as another app. Like, for example, Find My Phone on an Apple iPhone requires the ability at any moment for Apple to be able to touch your phone and say, wake up, tell me exactly what your location is, right? That's an incredibly powerful tool. And Apple doesn't allow anybody else to have access to that, right? You cannot run a background app that's grabbing people's location all the time and sending it up, and Apple has privacy protections around it. So that's a standard, that's a line they have held for years. And they've pretty much, things have only gotten tighter over the years. Like there's no good point that you can point out where either Google or Apple has said, we're going to all of a sudden let people do more, because there have been privacy scandals and there have been real impact on people. And so both of those companies have turned the knobs up. And so all of a sudden you have these governments asking them to turn those knobs way down. And the irony is that some of the governments asking that are the governments that have up to a month ago suing these companies for not doing enough around privacy. And so the best example is France right now. So Apple and Google, published a spec of what they believe to be, effectively they published a paper together that I read as them saying, this is as far as we will go, right? That they published a specification that allows you to, and the math is a little complicated, but effectively allows your phone to tell you if you have been exposed, if somebody else gets a positive test and says, I've been exposed, then all of a sudden a bunch of other people will get notifications saying you've been exposed, but it does so in a way that you can't figure out who that person is, right? So you might just get a notification and say, I was exposed, but you don't know it was Bob or Sally, right? Governments, that's not good enough for them, right? And France actually wants the capability to have more information. It looks like they want to know who these people actually are so they can reach out to them. Not a crazy thing, maybe in the context of France within their legal system, but you can imagine if Apple provided that capability to them, how that would be used in, say, a Turkey or a Vietnam or a place, Thailand, a place where there's currently kind of domestic civil unrest and there's been a bunch of oppression using electronic means. And so those companies are caught in the middle. And the French example is hilarious because the big French regulator, Canol, has spent over a year suing Google over what are really silly privacy arguments around flows in Android. And so all of a sudden they've changed their mind and they want to tell Google to ignore everything we've said about Android not being protected from privacy. We want you to drop a massive, important privacy protection for our app. And I expect that the companies are going to resist. They're going to resist because, one, they don't trust that these countries, that privacy regulators are going to give them a break, right? Like they after years and years of getting beaten up on some things that are actually not that impactful, I find it highly unlikely that Silicon Valley companies are just going to give in. And second, it is the international thing. If you give it to France, it is much harder to say no to another country because every country in the world has a legitimate need. And I think the slippery slope here is quite difficult for those companies.
Yeah. And so do you think that, and I guess this is for the startup founders who are joining us, do you think that it is within our roles as founders to draw the line for governments and say, no, you can't go further than this line, and you've actually, you're getting way too into people's privacies? Do you think that is our roles as founders?
I think if you are starting a company, you have a moral obligation to live up to a human rights standard that is independent of what legal system you're operating in, right? So this is like one of the fundamental problems the big companies have is that, when I was a CISO at Facebook likes to say we follow the law, we follow local law, right? That's not really true. Facebook is constantly deciding whether a local law is compatible with its own promises under human rights standards. And the big companies like the Googles and Facebooks and the Apples have figured that out the hard way. My suggestion to startup founders is to understand from the beginning that you might be placed in that situation. And that is, the situations where that's especially true is if you have very sensitive data. So if you have medical data, if you have location data, if you know deep knowledge about the people who you're servicing, or if you're carrying speech, right? If you're allowing people to have speech, especially speech that might be political, then eventually you're going to end up in a situation where there's going to be a conflict between what the law demands in the country and what you believe your responsibilities are. And so I would recommend that startup founders look to things like the UN Charter on Human Rights, that there's a thing called the Global Network Initiative, which is a group that represents a bunch of tech companies that has standards for this. And I would look at those standards and basically say, this is what we're going to follow, and try to hold yourself to that. When it comes to COVID specifically, I think there's way too many startup founders who are trying to jump right in to the things that are better done by governments. The truth is like the tracking and tracing and the like, those are going to be government functions. Governments are going to have companies write that software, it's going to be under contract, right? I don't think random startups should be building that. If you're a startup founder, if you're an engineer and you want to do something helpful, go find a much smaller organization. Find your local public health office, your local hospital, state level, and volunteer to help them. And I think that's the thing that's been missing a lot, is there hasn't been enough volunteering to do what much less sexy, but perhaps very impactful projects, right? If your local public health office is still using Microsoft Access, right? Helping them get onto a modern database in AWS and, doing this kind of work to do like just basic plumbing could be hugely effective in making their jobs easier.
Yeah. And do you see a world where, I suppose, giving up a little bit of our privacy in order for the public's health and safety, do you see a world where those two can coexist, or do you not see that?
Of privacy and COVID tracing coexisting? It's a real challenge. So a product that Google or the protocol that Google and Apple have proposed, in theory, would allow. But I think a lot of epidemiologists and people who work for government public health authorities don't think the capabilities there are sufficient. And so I think this is very tough. If you look like for the Chinese example, there, people have been allowed to re-enter society in China with apps that they carry around, and they get a QR code and a color, and it's extremely oppressive. It's tied into the social, the social credit system that's existed. It has a huge amount of data on people in the back end. And so I think we have this example of a situation of where we don't want to go, which is like the super aggressive Chinese example, where this tool is just another part of kind of a framework of social control. But in most Western democracies, we don't have a good example to build on that's a positive example. Like, governments have generally not done work around differential privacy. They haven't done work around, identifying people without knowing their PII or K-anonymity or all the kinds of deep work that people have done around privacy and data. There's very few governments have ever deployed anything that way. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that the conversation with the public health authorities lacks discussion of the tools that exist in 2020 to do this work. And so people pivot back to the easiest solution. What's the easiest solution? Well, you just have a database, and it's got a list of everybody, and tells you whether they're infected or not. And then you can see if phones are talking to each other. And I think this is going to be a fascinating struggle to see whether or not, because of the urgency of the moment, governments are able to get, especially Apple and Google, to loosen up. I hope we can come up with solutions that are perhaps more functional than the Apple Google proposal that could not be easily turned into really oppressive. Because, the other problem here is we don't know how long this could last. This emergency could last for years until we have a vaccine. In which case, anything that gets built right now could last for a very long time.
And actually, you recently announced that you started working as a consultant for Zoom. So I'm interested in learning, what can we as consumers of Zoom, because this is something that I'm using at work, I'm using with family members. How can we protect ourselves as we're currently remote working a lot, and also our kids are remote working as well?
Yeah. So there's two classes issues at Zoom. One is kind of the core information security issues, which Zoom's doing a lot of investment in. Really, the only advice for individuals there is to update, right? So Zoom is very aggressively releasing updates. A brand new update's coming out called 5.0 that has a ton of security fixes and upgrades in it. And so for the kind of core information security, unless you're a big enterprise, those concerns are less relevant. But for the bugs that are relevant, you just update. The other problem Zoom is dealing with is, just yesterday, the CEO, Eric, announced that Zoom has gone from 10 million daily users to 300 million, right? And with that growth is not just the growth in people, but a huge explosion in the use cases, right? So, Zoom was built as a enterprise VC company. It's for you to have, your staff meeting at 9 a.m. It's for you to talk to your lawyers. It's for you to have a sales meeting with a client. It was not built for people to have strangers attending yoga. It was not really designed for, the amount of distance learning that's happening. And so what's happened is kind of the metaphor of what a Zoom room has been expanded to all of these uses that for which it's not. The Zoom room used to be basically a corporate conference room. And now it's like you're taking strangers from thousands of miles away and you're inviting them into your corporate conference room, and bad things happen. And so, my suggestion for consumers is, one, if you get the newest Zoom client and you're a host, there's now a new security button. It's a little shield, and all the settings are in there. And so that's like one of the problems Zoom had was all of these security settings existed. They're just super hard to find because it was an enterprise IT product. And enterprise IT teams love lots of switches. They love lots of fiddly little switches. And, Mrs. Smith, the fifth grade teacher, or, the yoga teacher don't like fiddly switches. They want it simple. And so, one, look at that security button to set things. Make sure you have passwords set. I strongly recommend in any situation where your meeting might be exposed, to have the waiting room feature turned on. So when the waiting room's turned on, people have to ask to be admitted, and you can let them in. So make sure you have password, make sure you have waiting room. Be very careful with how you distribute links. That's the other problem that's been happening, is that people have been distributing them in ways that they think are private but aren't, right? So they're ending up like getting indexed by Google, and then people go through, they search for Zoom links, they trade them on Discord. For teachers, that's specifically hard. So you definitely want the waiting room. And then you also want to make sure to change your passwords maybe on a weekly basis. What's happening with schools is, you effectively have teenagers having other people pull the fire alarm. And so they will send the meeting ID and the password to somebody else on Instagram or Discord or Reddit. And then they go disrupt their class and they disrupt their class. And it's, they think it's funny, but for 14-year-olds, it's not actually a good thing. And it can turn into something that's really bad. And so make sure to lock it afterwards. And that's the other thing people aren't doing enough of is, let's say you have your yoga class, you've got the 20 people in, you've let them in, then click the security button and lock the meeting. And then you don't have to be bothered about anybody else coming in. So I think all the features are there. Zoom's going to continue to do work to make it easier for people to know and to kind of walk people through like, hey, it looks like you have hundreds of people coming. Maybe you actually want to do a webinar and not a meeting, right? That's the other thing. It's like right now we're doing a webinar. This is not a situation in which you'd want hundreds of strangers to have their cameras on. And so, click the webinar button instead of the meeting button